Hi, I apologize for the 3 segments to this recording. However, the system seems to get a little bit uncooperative when the segments go towards 20 minutes. And so rather than losing and having to re-record, which I've done before, I've divided it. But we're almost done. Hang in there with me. The very first service of the United Church of Canada was a communion service. On that day, June 10th, 1925, members of the new church enacted what was to become a beloved tradition, the simultaneous communion in which members partake of the elements together. In 1925, as we had noted, the atmosphere was reverentially penitential. There was no strident denunciation of sin. The emphasis was on invitation, for the sake of, quote, spiritual refreshing and the growth of the individual and the body in communion with the Lord. Renewal of strength leading to new life, following the commandments of God is the phrase that was used in the invitation. Now, with the publication of the service book in 1969, we start to see signs of a shift from penitence to celebration. The stress becomes more and more on the resurrection and the victory of Christ over the powers of sin and death. It becomes more Eucharistic, from the Greek word Eucharistia, which means thanksgiving. Praise and thanksgiving dominate, and a commissioning, a going out into the world, was added to the order of service before the benediction. Eucharistic prayer forms developed in several different directions, so that when Celebrate God's Presence, our current book of worship resources, was published in 2000, there are 11 different communion prayers, ranging from one attributed to Hippolytus to United Church prayers to feminist and international sources, along with encouragement for contextual and extemporaneous experimentation. Song of Faith and Celebrate God's Presence together take a multivalent approach, which is reminiscent of baptism, Eucharist, and ministry. Thanks to God, remembering Jesus, invoking the Spirit, communing with God and one another, rehearsing God's future, all of those are included in one form or another in our communion practice. We find inclusive welcome, hospitality, feeding, friendship, commissioning, forgiveness, love, remembrance of Jesus, brokenness and promise, hope, and eschatological vision, all inseparably linked to justice. The one whom we call Holy Mystery is also Holy Love. There is as much emphasis placed on multivocal description as there is on univocal definition. The emphasis is less on a systematic description of sacraments and more on the poetic innovation of sacramentality. In the words of James White, a noted historian of liturgical practice, that sacramentality is, and I quote, the concept that the outward and visible can convey the inward and spiritual. Physical actions and physical matters can become transparent vehicles of divine activity and presence. In short, sacraments can be God's love made visible. Now, for Martin Luther, it all came down to the confluence of symbol, promise, and sign. In baptism and bread, the commands of Jesus revealed the promises of God, with signs attached to them. Sacraments of scriptural promises to which Christ has given a visual sign. By contrast, Ulrich Zwingli, the skilled linguist that he was, worked from the original meaning of sacramentum, which is an oath of allegiance. Quote, the sacraments are signs or ceremonials which inform the whole church of your faith, end of quote. Professions of faith, to be sure, but human memorials nonetheless. John Calvin found Augustine's definition most helpful. Quote, an inward sign of an invisible grace, end of quote. But for Calvin, the signs were an acts of generous condescension by Almighty God for our frailty. In the midst of the Enlightenment, Immanuel Kant argued that any claim to the sacraments are means of grace with any real connection to divine action is illusion. United Church sacramental theology, along with other parts of the Church, continues to wrestle with some age-old questions. How can the visible be related to the invisible? How can a living body be related to a risen body? How can the earth be related to its makers? Is it by divine promise as sacred sign, a la Luther, a memorial profession of faith, a la Zwingli, a divine gracious condescension, according to Calvin, or a human moralistic celebration, according to Kant? Well, in my estimation, the Song of Faith appears to allow all of these. And I quote, To point to the presence of the holy in the world, the Church receives, consecrates, and shares visible signs of the grace of God. In company with the churches of the Reformed and Methodist traditions, we celebrate two sacraments as gifts of Christ, baptism and Holy Communion. In these sacraments, the ordinary things of life, water, bread, and wine, point beyond themselves to God and God's love, teaching us to be alert to the sacred in the midst of life. Sacramentality asserts that the outward is in the inward. The invisible is in the visible. The binary relationship of outward and inward, visible and invisible, is not enough. God's presence is deeply embedded in the midst of life. In a sense, that is modeled on the Christ event, the mystery of the Word made flesh, the dance of the Trinity, and the affirmation of the sanctity of all life in God's good earth. And so there is evidence of increasing sacramentality in the United Church of Canada's life, with the growth of the popularity of the word and to table pattern. From the earliest service books, there has been an increasing concentration on the table as being central and regular, rather than occasional and special. Word and sacrament are much more in unity now in our practice than they were almost 100 years ago. So the most common form of order now is gathering, word, thanksgiving, and sending forth. The Song of Faith pushes our sacramental theology towards sacramentality of life, without avoiding propositional phrases like those found in earlier statements. The poetical and lyrical style shifts the discourse from definition to evocation, from systematics to theopoetics. It's a kind of thick description, embracing many unresolved tensions. It strikes a unique, if somewhat hard to define, post-liberal stance that can be understood in different ways, including sacramentality. Faithfulness is not about only Orthodox sacramental practice or liberal sacramental expression, but about the holiness of all of life. Hope I've given you something to think about. Grace and peace.